The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of their private quarters. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass while she watched the early groundskeepers tend to the gardens below. The weight of the decision they had made just hours before pressed heavily on her chest, making each breath feel deliberate and measured. Prince William emerged from their bedroom, his usually perfect hair tousled from a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of the countless hours they had spent discussing, arguing, and ultimately accepting what had to be done. He moved to stand behind Catherine, his hands gently resting on her shoulders as they both gazed out at the estate that had been their sanctuary for so many years. The palace had been unusually quiet that morning. Even the staff seemed to sense the gravity of what was unfolding within the royal walls. Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, had delivered their morning tea with trembling hands, her eyes moist with unshed tears. She had served the royal family for over 30 years and had never witnessed anything quite like this. Catherine turned in William's arms, her green eyes searching his face for any sign that they might reconsider. The decision to temporarily step back from their royal duties had not come lightly. The relentless pressure from recent scandals within the monarchy, combined with the intense media scrutiny surrounding their children's privacy, had reached a breaking point that neither of them could ignore any longer. "The children don't understand why we've been so distant lately," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast room. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis had noticed the change in their parents' demeanor over the past weeks. The usually vibrant family dinners had become subdued affairs, with forced smiles and careful conversations. William cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to remain composed. They had always been the steady ones, the future of the monarchy that everyone looked to for stability and hope. The weight of disappointing an entire nation felt crushing, but the weight of losing their family's peace felt even heavier. The couple had spent the previous evening walking through the gardens where they had shared so many private moments away from the public eye. They remembered their first official photo shoot as newlyweds in these very gardens, full of hope and determination to serve their country. Now, 12 years later, they found themselves questioning whether they could continue to give everything they had while protecting what mattered most to them. Their private secretary had been calling repeatedly since dawn, no doubt fielding inquiries from Buckingham Palace about the unusual silence from Kensington Palace. The normal routine of royal engagements, charity events, and public appearances had been quietly cancelled for the week, causing speculation among royal watchers and journalists who followed their every move. Catherine moved to their writing desk, where a half-finished letter lay waiting. She had been trying to find the right words to explain their decision to the British people. But how do you tell a nation that has embraced you as their future queen that you need to step away, even if temporarily? How do you explain that behind the smiles and waves, a family was struggling to find balance between duty and survival? The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the courtyard below, where George, Charlotte, and Louis were playing with their security detail during their morning break from private tutoring. The sight of their carefree play made both parents pause, remembering what they were fighting to protect. Their children had been born into this life, but William and Catherine were determined that they would also know what it meant to simply be children. As the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across their private sitting room, both William and Catherine knew that the day ahead would change everything. The conversation they were about to have with the Queen would either lead to understanding and support, or create a rift that might never fully heal. Either way, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The drive to Buckingham Palace felt longer than usual, despite the familiar route that William and Catherine had traveled countless times before. Their black Range Rover moved through the London streets with its usual security escort, but inside the vehicle, an uncomfortable silence had settled between them. Catherine's hands remained folded in her lap, occasionally smoothing the fabric of her navy dress, while William stared out the window at the city that would soon learn of their decision. The Queen had requested their presence for an urgent private audience, and both William and Catherine knew that news of their unusual behavior had already reached her ears. Queen Elizabeth had lived through enough royal crises to recognize the signs of a family in distress, and the sudden cancellation of their engagements had not gone unnoticed by palace officials. As they passed through the palace gates, Catherine caught sight of the familiar tourists and photographers gathered outside, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. Soon, these same people would be questioning everything they thought they knew about the couple they had come to adore. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. Inside the palace, they were escorted through the corridors lined with centuries of royal portraits. Each painting seemed to watch them pass. Generations of monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices between personal happiness and royal duty. William's great-grandmother's portrait seemed particularly poignant as they walked by, her painted eyes holding the same weight of responsibility that he now carried. The Queen's private study was exactly as they remembered it, with its familiar scent of lavender and old books. Queen Elizabeth sat behind her mahogany desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed documents. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable but her eyes showing the concern of both a sovereign and a great-grandmother. "Please, sit," she said simply, gesturing to the chairs positioned across from her desk. The formality of the moment was not lost on any of them, though they had shared countless informal family gatherings in this very room. William cleared his throat, the words they had practiced that morning suddenly feeling inadequate. "Your Majesty, we've come to discuss our future role within the family," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Catherine and I have been facing some challenges that have made us reconsider our current level of public engagement." The Queen removed her glasses and set them carefully on the desk, her hands folding in the same manner that Catherine unconsciously mirrored. "I see," she said quietly. "And these challenges, are they something that the family can help address, or have you already made your decision?" Catherine spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice soft but determined. "We haven't made any permanent decisions, Your Majesty, but we need time to protect our children and find a way to serve that doesn't compromise our family's well-being." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had with the Queen. She listened without judgment as they explained the mounting pressure, the invasive media attention that had begun affecting their children's daily lives, and their fear that they were losing themselves in the constant performance of royal duty. The Queen shared stories they had never heard before, about her own struggles in the early years of her reign, about the sacrifices she had made and the regrets she carried. She spoke about Prince Philip's initial resistance to royal life and how they had found ways to maintain their marriage while serving the crown. "The monarchy has survived many storms," she said finally, her voice carrying the wisdom of 7 decades on the throne, "but it has only survived because we have learned to adapt. If you need to step back to move forward, then we must find a way to make that possible." The relief that washed over both William and Catherine was palpable, but it was quickly followed by the realization that their decision would soon become public knowledge. The Queen's understanding was just the first hurdle. Now they had to face the British people, the Commonwealth, and a media that would dissect every word of their announcement. As they prepared to leave the palace, the Queen walked them to the door, something she rarely did for official meetings. "Remember," she said, placing a gentle hand on Catherine's arm, "you are not just my grandson and his wife. You are parents first, and I will support whatever decision protects those children." The drive back to Windsor was filled with a different kind of silence, one that spoke of shared understanding rather than uncertainty. They had crossed a bridge that morning, and though they didn't yet know what waited on the other side, they were no longer walking toward it alone. The news broke on a Tuesday morning that would forever be remembered in British history. Catherine sat in their private office at Kensington Palace, watching the television coverage with a mixture of relief and heartbreak, as news anchors struggled to find the right words to explain the unprecedented announcement. The official statement had been released just an hour earlier, but already the phone hadn't stopped ringing. Their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales, have decided to take a temporary leave from their official royal duties to focus on their family's well-being and their children's privacy. This decision has been made with the full support of Her Majesty the Queen. The words looked so simple on paper, but Catherine knew the earthquake they had triggered across the nation and beyond. Social media was exploding with reactions ranging from support to outrage, and the hashtag Royal Farewell was trending worldwide within minutes of the announcement. William paced behind her, occasionally pausing to look over her shoulder at the screen. News reporters were already gathering outside the palace gates, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any glimpse of the couple who had just shocked the world. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their quest for privacy was creating more media attention than they had ever experienced. Their children had been quietly moved to a safe house earlier that morning, accompanied by their most trusted security team and their nanny, Maria. The decision to separate from them, even temporarily, had been the hardest part of this entire process. George, at 10 years old, had asked pointed questions about why they couldn't all stay together, while 8-year-old Charlotte had simply hugged her mother tighter when they said goodbye. The palace phone system was overwhelmed with calls from government officials, charity organizations, and foreign dignitaries trying to understand what this meant for upcoming engagements and international relations. Private Secretary James Morrison looked exhausted as he fielded call after call, trying to provide answers to questions that even he didn't fully understand yet. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Pippa. "Saw the news. Are you okay? Call me when you can." Similar messages were coming from friends and family members who had learned about the decision along with the rest of the world. The couple had made the difficult choice to keep their plan private even from their closest confidants, knowing that any leak could have made the situation even more complicated. The television coverage showed crowds beginning to gather outside Buckingham Palace, many holding signs of support for William and Catherine. "We love you, Kate," one sign read, while another declared, "Mental health matters." The sight of ordinary British citizens standing in solidarity with their decision brought tears to Catherine's eyes, reminding her why they had fallen in love with public service in the first place. Prime Minister's office had issued a statement of support within hours, recognizing the couple's right to prioritize their family while acknowledging the valuable service they had provided to the nation. International media outlets were comparing the announcement to previous royal departures, but commentators struggled to find historical precedent for such a decision made by direct heirs to the throne. The Commonwealth representatives were requesting emergency consultations to understand how this would affect their planned tours and engagements. William and Catherine had been scheduled to visit Australia and New Zealand the following month, a trip that had been planned for over a year and was considered crucial for maintaining Commonwealth relationships. As evening approached, they found themselves watching the evening news coverage from their sitting room, holding hands as they witnessed the global reaction to their choice. The BBC had organized a panel of royal experts, historians, and psychologists to discuss the implications of their decision, and the conversations ranged from supportive to deeply critical. "This is either the most honest thing the royal family has done in decades, or it's a complete abandonment of duty," one commentator argued, while another countered, "They're showing that even royals are human beings with limits." Catherine muted the television and looked at William, both of them processing the reality that their private struggle had become a public debate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they navigated their first day as royals, who had chosen to step back. But tonight they could finally sleep, knowing that they had chosen their family's well-being over public expectation. The hardest part was yet to come, explaining to their children why the world was talking about their family, and helping them understand that sometimes doing the right thing meant disappointing the people you care about most. 3 days after the announcement, William and Catherine made their way to a small cottage in the Cotswolds where their children had been staying. The drive through the English countryside felt surreal, as they passed ordinary families going about their daily lives, while their own family remained the subject of intense global scrutiny. The cottage, borrowed from a trusted family friend, sat nestled among rolling hills and ancient oak trees, far from the cameras and crowds that had gathered around their usual residences. George met them at the door, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mummy, why is everyone on television talking about us?" he asked, wrapping his arms around Catherine's waist. The question they had been dreading hung in the air between them, requiring an honesty that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Catherine knelt to meet her son's eyes, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions to protect the people they love most," she explained, smoothing his hair with gentle fingers. "Daddy and I decided that we needed to spend more time being your parents and less time being photographed." Charlotte, ever perceptive, looked between her parents with the wisdom that often surprised adults. "Are we in trouble?" she asked quietly, and William quickly gathered her into his arms, assuring her that nothing was their fault. Prince Louis, still young enough to be primarily concerned with immediate needs, simply wanted to know when they could all go home together. The afternoon was spent in the cottage garden, where they attempted to create a sense of normalcy, amid the chaos surrounding their lives. They picked wildflowers and fed ducks at a nearby pond, activities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances due to security concerns and media attention. For a few precious hours, they were simply a family enjoying time together without the weight of royal obligation. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, William and Catherine sat in the cottage's small kitchen, reading through hundreds of letters that had been forwarded from Kensington Palace. The response from the British public had been overwhelming, with messages of support far outnumbering the criticism they had feared. One letter from a mother in Manchester particularly moved Catherine. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for showing my daughters that it's okay to choose family over everything else. You've given mothers everywhere permission to put their children first." Another, from a veteran who had served in Afghanistan, told William, "Sir, you've shown the same courage in protecting your family that you showed serving your country." The cottage had no internet connection by design, but their private secretary had provided them with a summary of the global reaction. Support was pouring in from unexpected places, including several European royal families who had faced similar struggles with media intrusion. The Swedish crown princess had issued a statement praising their courage, while the Dutch royal family had privately offered their estate as a retreat if needed. However, not all the feedback was positive. Several parliamentary members had questioned whether the couple should continue to receive public funding if they weren't fulfilling their public duties. Constitutional experts were debating the precedent this set for future generations of royals, and some traditional monarchists felt betrayed by what they saw as an abandonment of sacred duty. The Queen had called that evening, not for an official update, but simply to speak with her great-grandchildren. The sound of Louis giggling as he told his gun about the ducks they had fed provided a moment of lightness that everyone desperately needed. Her Majesty listened patiently to each child's account of their day, asking questions about their drawings and promising to see them soon. Later, as William and Catherine prepared for bed in the cottage's simple guest room, they reflected on how different their lives felt after just 3 days. Without the constant schedule of engagements, speeches, and public appearances, they had rediscovered what it meant to wake up without immediately thinking about cameras and protocol. Catherine found herself checking her reflection less frequently, no longer automatically considering how every expression and gesture would be analyzed and photographed. William had stopped reaching for his phone first thing in the morning, knowing that his schedule was clear and his only obligation was to be present with his family. The weight of their decision continued to settle around them, bringing both relief and uncertainty. They had chosen a path that felt right for their family, but the long-term consequences remained unknown. As they fell asleep to the sound of countryside quiet instead of London traffic, both of them wondered what the coming weeks would bring and whether they had made a choice they could live with for the rest of their lives. Tomorrow would mark their first weekend as a family without any royal obligations, a freedom they hadn't experienced since their children were born. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, representing everything they had gained and everything they had potentially lost in their bid to reclaim their lives. 2 weeks into their retreat from public life, the reality of their decision began to crystallize in ways they hadn't anticipated. Catherine stood in the small kitchen of their temporary home, preparing a simple breakfast while listening to the radio's morning news program. The presenter was discussing the upcoming state visit from the Japanese emperor, noting that Prince Charles would now be handling the engagement that had originally been planned for William and Catherine. The pang of loss that hit her was unexpected and sharp. These state visits had been some of their most meaningful work, opportunities to strengthen international relationships and represent British values on the world stage. Hearing about important events continuing without them brought home the reality that life was moving forward, with or without their participation. William entered the kitchen just as the radio announcer mentioned a charity gala that Catherine had been scheduled to attend, now being covered by Princess Anne instead. His sister-in-law had stepped in gracefully, as she always did, but the couple couldn't help feeling that they were watching their life's work continue in their absence. The children had adapted to their new routine with the resilience that young people possess, but even they were beginning to ask questions about when they would return to their normal lives. George had mentioned missing his weekly visits to the youth center, where he had been learning about environmental conservation, while Charlotte wondered when she would see the ponies at the royal stables again. Their temporary isolation had given them perspective on what they had been missing during their years of constant public engagement. William had rediscovered his love of painting, spending hours capturing the countryside landscape in watercolors while the children played nearby. Catherine had begun writing in a journal for the first time since university, processing not just their current situation, but years of experiences that she had never had time to fully absorb. The cottage phone rang infrequently, but when it did, the calls were significant. Their private secretary had begun scheduling weekly briefings to keep them informed about pressing matters that might require their input. The Queen had established a routine of Sunday evening calls, not to pressure them about returning, but to maintain the family connection that had always been important to her. One particularly difficult call came from the head of one of Catherine's patronages, a mental health charity that had been struggling to maintain funding without her high-profile support. The conversation was heartbreaking, as Catherine listened to how their work with troubled teenagers was being scaled back due to reduced donations following her absence from public events. That night, after the children were asleep, William and Catherine walked through the cottage garden in silence, both grappling with the unintended consequences of their choice. They had wanted to protect their family, but their withdrawal was affecting other families who depended on the attention and resources that royal patronage brought to charitable causes. "Maybe we can find a different way," Catherine suggested quietly, her voice carrying the weight of realization. "Something that protects the children but still allows us to support the causes that matter." The idea of a middle ground began to take shape over the following days. They started imagining a modified approach to royal duty, one that might involve fewer formal engagements but more meaningful, long-term commitments. Perhaps they could work more closely with a smaller number of charities, giving them deeper involvement rather than the broad but sometimes superficial coverage they had maintained before. William reached out to several family, friends who had experience balancing public service with private life, including former diplomats and business leaders who had found ways to contribute meaningfully without sacrificing their family's well-being. These conversations opened new possibilities for how they might structure their return to public life, if and when they decided to do so. The media coverage of their absence had evolved from shock and speculation to a more nuanced discussion about the pressures faced by public figures and the importance of mental health. Several major newspapers had published thoughtful editorials about the need for reform in how the royal family approached duty and privacy, acknowledging that the old models might not be sustainable for future generations. Celebrity friends who had faced similar struggles with media intrusion began reaching out privately, sharing their own experiences and offering support. These conversations helped William and Catherine understand that their struggle was not unique, and that finding balance between public service and private life was a challenge faced by many people in high-profile positions. As their third week of retreat began, both William and Catherine found themselves less focused on what they had left behind and more interested in what they might be able to build in the future. The time away had given them clarity about their values and priorities, but it had also shown them how much they missed the opportunity to make a positive difference in other people's lives. The question was no longer whether they would return to public life, but how they could return in a way that honored both their commitment to service and their responsibility to their children. 1 month after their retreat began, an unexpected visitor arrived at the cottage. Princess Anne's car pulled up the gravel drive on a gray Thursday morning, causing a flutter of excitement among the children who hadn't seen their great-aunt since before their parents' announcement. Anne had always been their favorite royal relative, known for her straightforward manner and genuine affection for her great-nieces and nephew. Catherine watched from the kitchen window as Anne emerged from her car, noting the determined set of her shoulders and the folder tucked under her arm. This wasn't a casual family visit. Anne had come with purpose, and Catherine suspected it had to do with the increasing pressure from Parliament and the press for a resolution to their situation. Over tea in the cottage's modest sitting room, Anne laid out the political reality with her characteristic bluntness. "The government is getting restless," she explained, her eyes moving between William and Catherine. "There are questions being raised about constitutional precedent and public funding. More importantly, there are international commitments that can't be postponed indefinitely." The folder she had brought contained a detailed analysis of the couple's upcoming obligations, including a Commonwealth tour that had been planned for 18 months and several trade missions that were considered crucial for post-Brexit relationships. Canceling or transferring these commitments was becoming increasingly difficult, and some international partners were beginning to question Britain's reliability. William studied the documents while Catherine played with Louis on the sitting room floor, both of them processing the weight of responsibility that their retreat had temporarily lifted from their shoulders. The freedom they had found in the cottage felt precious, but the impact of their absence was rippling outward in ways they hadn't fully considered. "What if we approached this differently?" Catherine asked, looking up from where Louis was showing her his latest drawing. "What if we negotiated new terms instead of just returning to the old ones?" Anne raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite her initial skepticism. "What kind of terms?" Over the next several hours, they outlined a proposal that had been forming in their minds during their weeks of reflection. They would return to public duty, but with significant modifications to protect their family's privacy and well-being. School holidays would be completely protected time, with no official engagements scheduled when the children were home. International tours would be limited to one per year, and domestic engagements would be clustered to allow for longer periods of family time. Most importantly, they wanted to establish clear boundaries around their children's privacy, with legal consequences for media outlets that violated agreed-upon guidelines. They had seen how Princess Caroline of Monaco had successfully fought for her children's privacy through the European courts, and they were prepared to take similar action if necessary. Anne listened carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions about logistics and constitutional implications. "You realize this would require the Queen's approval, parliamentary discussion, and probably new legislation," she warned. "It's not impossible, but it won't be simple." The conversation was interrupted by George and Charlotte bursting into the room, excited to show their great-aunt the vegetable garden they had been tending. As Anne admired their tomatoes and listened to their animated descriptions of cottage life, Catherine noticed something she hadn't seen in months. Her children were completely relaxed and unself-conscious, not performing for an audience or worrying about protocol. That evening, after Anne had left with promises to present their proposal to the Queen and relevant officials, William and Catherine sat in their garden watching the sunset. The cottage had become a sanctuary where they had rediscovered who they were as individuals, as a couple and as parents. The thought of leaving this peace behind was daunting, but they were beginning to understand that running away from their responsibilities wasn't a long-term solution. "Do you think we can really change how things work?" Catherine asked, her hand finding William's as they sat on the old wooden bench they had grown to love. William was quiet for a long moment, considering everything they had learned about themselves and their situation over the past month. "I think we have to try," he said finally. "Not just for us, but for George and Charlotte and Louis. They shouldn't have to choose between family and duty the way we did." The next morning brought news that the Queen had agreed to meet with them to discuss their proposal. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving them time to refine their ideas and prepare for what might be the most important conversation of their royal lives. As they began preparing to leave the cottage, both William and Catherine felt the weight of transition settling around them. They were no longer the same people who had fled to this peaceful retreat a month ago. They had found their voices as advocates for their own family, and now they were ready to use those voices to advocate for change within an institution that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The cottage had taught them that it was possible to live differently, and now they were determined to find a way to bring some of that peace and authenticity back to their public lives. 6 weeks after their retreat began, William and Catherine stood once again in the Queen's private study at Buckingham Palace, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. Gone was the desperation and uncertainty that had characterized their first meeting. In its place was a quiet confidence, born from their time away and their newfound clarity about what they needed to make their public service sustainable. The Queen listened intently as they presented their detailed proposal for a modified approach to royal duty. They had spent days refining their ideas with input from constitutional experts, child psychologists, and even representatives from other European royal families who had successfully modernized their approaches to public service. "Your proposal is thoughtful," the Queen said finally, removing her reading glasses and setting aside the documents they had prepared. It represents a significant departure from tradition, but perhaps that's exactly what's needed. The weeks that followed their return to London were unlike anything they had experienced before. Rather than simply resuming their previous schedule, they worked closely with palace officials to implement their new framework. The process required delicate negotiations with government officials, media representatives, and Commonwealth partners, but the support they received surprised many observers. The British public, who had watched their struggle unfold with growing sympathy, largely embraced the changes. Opinion polls showed strong support for protecting royal children's privacy and allowing working parents, even royal ones, to prioritize family time. The couple's honesty about their struggles had resonated with ordinary families facing their own challenges in balancing work and home life. Their first public engagement after the retreat was carefully chosen, a visit to a family support center in Manchester, where they spoke openly about the importance of mental health and family well-being. The conversations they had with other parents were genuine and unscripted, reflecting the authenticity they had rediscovered during their time away. Catherine found herself speaking more honestly about the challenges of motherhood, sharing insights she had gained during their cottage retreat about the importance of being present with children rather than simply being busy on their behalf. William discussed the pressure he had felt to be perfect, and how their time away had taught him that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. The media coverage of their return was cautiously positive, with many commentators noting the increased naturalness in their public interactions. The couple seemed more relaxed, more connected to each other, and more genuinely engaged with the people they met. The calculated polish that had sometimes made them seem distant had been replaced by an approachable warmth that drew people in. Their children's lives had indeed improved dramatically under the new arrangements. School holidays were protected family time, with no exceptions for official duties. When they did appear at public events, it was by choice rather than obligation, and strict guidelines ensured that their privacy was respected by photographers and journalists. The constitutional changes required to formalize their new approach took months to implement, but the precedent they set had immediate effects on how the royal family approached work-life balance. Younger royals began negotiating their own boundaries, and the palace instituted new policies about family time and mental health support for all working members of the royal family. 1 year after their emotional goodbye to traditional royal life, William and Catherine hosted a garden party at Kensington Palace for the families and organizations that had supported them during their transition. As they watched George, Charlotte, and Louis play freely with other children while their parents mingled with guests, both of them reflected on how much had changed. The sacrifice had been real. They had given up some of the grandeur and constant public attention that had defined their early years as royals. But what they had gained felt immeasurably more valuable. Their marriage was stronger, their children were happier, and their public service felt more meaningful because it came from choice rather than obligation. As the sun set over their garden party, Catherine found William watching their children with the same wonder she felt every day. They had learned that it was possible to serve their country and their family simultaneously, but only when they were honest about what they needed to make that service sustainable. The goodbye that had broken Britain's heart had ultimately led to a new beginning, one that honored both duty and love in ways that felt authentic and sustainable. Their story became a testament to the power of choosing family without abandoning purpose, and of finding the courage to change systems that no longer serve the people within them. The cottage in the Cotswolds remained their retreat, a place where they could always remember who they were beneath the titles and expectations. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons, they would return there with their children to pick wildflowers and feed ducks, grateful for the difficult decision that had ultimately set them all free.